Hello and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. My name is Olivia Tuller and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on October 17th with Maureen Brady on mining the treasures of family search. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search on our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Suzanne Hoffman on Mayhem on a Manifest. Suzanne Hoffman, or the genealogy maven, has been working as a professional forensic genealogist for the past 3 years. She is also a specialist in Eastern European research and immigration. She has done extensive research in early Illinois, New England, and Virginia families in the U.S., and Poland and Lithuania ancestry to the mid-1700s abroad. A graduate of the Boston University Genealogical Research Certificate Program, ProGen, GenProof, Forensic Genealogy 1 and 2 from GRIP, and other institute courses, she is currently working on her portfolio to earn her credentials for both her CG and AG. And we'll now turn the time over to Suzanne for her presentation.
Thank you, Olivia.
Yeah.
So welcome, everyone. This is Mayhem on a Manifest, as Olivia said. My name's Suzanne Hoffman. I'm actually from Boston, Massachusetts originally, but I've lived in Chicago for over 40 years. I'm the Vice President of the Association of Professional Genealogists and the Secretary for the Illinois State Genealogical Society. I volunteer at the Wilmette Family Search Center. I do so 3 days a week, and I'm a forensic genealogist, as I said, with expertise in immigration and naturalization. I am going to counsel you to sit back and enjoy this madcap adventure presentation. So what we're looking at this first page is the SS Saratov, and this is the actual ship. It was dry docked in probably the late 1800s from being a cargo ship turned over into a passenger ferry for 2 years that it lasted. And the actual hull of this ship was repurposed and used in the Russian military all the way until March of 2022. So this ship has had a long career. It was sunk by a Ukrainian missile in 2022. So most of my research involves immigrants and their journeys, and I found researching my husband's deep Illinois and mid-Atlantic roots to be too easy compared to my elusive Lithuanian and Belarusian forebears. I know more about my husband's 17th century lineage than I do about the protagonist of this talk, one Jacob Hoffman, who lived the majority of his life in the 20th century. I usually start by bringing an ancestor to life by tracing backwards and identifying their route to America and then linking the vital records and primary documents, just as you would do. But this effort was vastly different. So we're going to take a journey, travelogue fashion, since the revealing of the facts in their original order is what makes this journey truly remarkable. So the image behind, as I said, is the SS Saratov. It's a steam-powered trawler. It was designed for cargo hauling. It was built in 1891, and it only made 5 trips carrying passengers between 1907 and 1908. And then it was repurposed back to cargo and then re-outfitted for the military. But finding a manifest is usually like manna from heaven. If you're doing any kind of immigration or naturalization, the first thing you want to find is that manifest, except when it's not, especially not when it opens a Pandora's box and leaves more questions than it does provide answers. So every page left a breadcrumb trail in another direction. I was simply trying to trace an ancestor, but that's not what happened. So I do adhere to genealogy standards. I do believe in exhaustive research. This was rabbit hole research. I dove in and I kept diving. So knowing a bit about the laws at the time, it's very helpful to understand the events. So the Immigration Act of 1906 is pivotal in this whole discussion. Ellis Island, as we know, was established in 1892 as the first major port landing station to handle the volume of immigrants from the various European ports. The federal government assumed direct control of inspecting, admitting, rejecting, and processing all immigrants seeking admission to the United States with the Immigration Act of 1891. And of course, Ellis Island was the first large scale operation to adhere to those standards. After understanding the flaws in that initial federal law, the Immigration Act of 1906 focused on those immigrants that tried to circumvent the established means of admission by establishing the Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization. And that's where the mayhem comes in. So the Immigration Act of 1906 was largely in part to stop stowaways and illegal or undesirable immigrants from landing in the United States. The law in particular established the Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization, which provided the first uniform laws in the country and gave the federal government complete control. Because up until that point, the states had authority. So every single port, and there were 59 of them around the perimeter of the United States, every single port had their own jurisdiction, their own laws, and their own way of screening individuals. So this was now all standardized. So passengers who arrived after June of 1906 could not be naturalized without a certificate of arrival verifying their original date of admission into the United States. That certificate of arrival is like gold. Um, Record Group 85, Entry 11, supposedly contains a complete list of all detainees and those who were deported, but that file no longer exists. Somewhere in the bowels of USCIS in College Park, Maryland, it may be, but nobody's found it yet. The Saratov, the SS Saratov, and the culpable Russian volunteer fleet was heavily scrutinized based on their previous suspected perfidy. This was a known trap. We're going to look at what got caught in that trap. While the goal is to improve the economy by creating revenue streams for those providing services related to the wave of immigration, right? The United States solicited for people to come to the United States to become migrant farm workers, to become industrial participants, to go into mining. We needed people. So we were welcoming people. We were uh, actually looking for people to come to the United States. So there were broadsides that were sent into the countries that we know were war torn and strife ridden to come to the United States, the land of plenty, the land of gold. And it often created sort of a price gouging and unfair competition among the different lines of shipping. So there was a wide scale collusion and price fixing on the transatlantic shipping lines starting in about 1892. We knew we could handle more people coming in. So by 1908, the North Atlantic Conference fixed, and that was a new organization. It's basically an organization of all these different shipping lines. They fixed the passenger percentages. In other words, the percentage of occupancy that a particular ship could come over on, and the pricing between all of these different lines. Um, it had a negative effect on price gouging, created poor sanitary and safety conditions for the travelers themselves without these guidelines from the North Atlantic Conference. Shipping companies from Germany, Britain, France, Holland, Belgium, Norway, Sweden, Canada, and the United States, as well as others ferrying immigrants to North America, participated in this scheme. The US started to charge the shipping lines for the return passage of any passenger not being able to pass the medical exam that was mainly focused on highly contagious diseases and to limit the number of persons whose ailments would make them a likely public charge and an expense, obviously, to the US economy. So, notably absent was the immigration backdoor of Russia. It's not uncommon for travelers to be bilked out of their prepaid tickets. They had paid for in installments. People from the United States had paid for tickets and sent them to as a like a chit or a check that went over in the mail and said, here's your passage. It's not really your ticket. You pick up your ticket when you get to the actual departure. And of course, they'd get there and there'd be no ticket. So there was sort of a trust that had to be formed between the agent trying to sell the shipping tickets and the people who were actually buying them, whether those people who were buying them were out of the United States or they were in fact in Europe. Train lines routinely stopped service or ran out of seats on popular lines. Again, a lot of the train lines were controlled by the actual uh, shipping lines. There was collusion going on there. The goal was to take as much away from the travelers as they possibly could. So the longer the distance, the more checkpoints they had to go through if they were going west to travel to the United States. So every single checkpoint would have a different rule or a different guideline for what you could carry, how much money you could take. The public inspections that went on that looked at level of cleanliness, that had a medical exam, everybody was scrutinized. Identity cards were checked very often. Male passengers were scrutinized about draft requirements, especially if they were coming from Eastern Europe. They had just gotten over, a variety of different wars and economic times moving into the 1880s, 1890s. It was sort of a peacetime draft that was going on, but the Russians were always amassing people to be in their um, home ground military, and they kept that up, knowing that there was a Russian Revolution coming forward. There were different prohibitions on what you could take, and they changed. Each inspection station was different, and people who wrote letters back to their original families told about the strife of trying to get to the port of embarkation and what happened along the way. So there was a very interesting document you needed coming out of Russia, and it was a certificate of probity, and it was issued by the local police that would attest to the honesty and the moral integrity of the entire family, regardless of who was traveling. This was needed to apply for a passport, and the passports were of two different kinds. In order to leave Tsarist Russia, you legally needed a passport, but most people had an internal passport only. You had to actually get a passport that will allow you to go outside the country. You had to have your ticket, and you had to pass the required medical exam. Now, what's interesting is, again, the medical exam is different in coming out of Russia than it was coming out of Germany, coming out of Poland or Lithuania, which really didn't exist at that point in time. So you had to know your path going, which is why an awful lot of people looked east to leave instead of going west. So um, the bureaucratic obstacles were insurmountable in some instances, and that resulted in some reckless behavior, which we're going to encounter. The checkpoints increased transit times by up to 2 weeks or more. The health checks rejected, it says 3 to 5% of immigrants before they boarded the ship. I think that's probably low. I think it was probably a little bit higher than that amount. And there was predatory practices that existed just to deplete the funds carried by immigrants prior to crossing. So you may have paid for your train ticket, and then they come back and said, "Oh, well, your fare is no longer valid because the coach fare or the third class fare has now gone up," or things like that. So there were all kinds of strange things that people had no way of validating before they were waiting to depart. So this was a poster that advertised the Saratov. Now, if you remember what it looked like, doesn't quite look the same. So the shipping agents actively sought passengers for this. Rusko-Amerikanskaya Linia. So it's the Russian-American line. And this is the Saratov, and it does say that on the poster itself. And just like the image of this luxurious ship, reality is often a great deal different than what you imagine. Here's the actual line to get on Saratov. So this is the Saratov in the background, and this photograph was dated 1908. I have no way of validating that, but um, uh, it came out of Ellis Island with a just a notation that it was 1908. So there's the actual people lining up. They don't look like they're carrying a heck of a lot. We normally see people carrying a lot of goods. The stevedores may have already taken their goods, put them below decks. I'm not sure, but this was really suspicious to me because people look like they're really not carrying a heck of a lot. If you can see this, I know the image is light here. This is the National Maritime Museum in London, and this is the actual decks of the Saratov. There were three decks, and the below deck, if you can actually look, you know, each one of those blue lines that are outlined there, those are berths. So this ship was packed to the gills with people. There's sardines. There's 21-day trip, and I'm certain the second class passengers didn't fare that much better because you've got uh, the second class is in the back half of the Saratov here, and there's the first class up front. So you've got three decks. You've got steerage, then you've got second and first class, and then you've got the promenade deck, and there's the dining area and things like that. There were berths for 1,500 below decks and limited space for 170 above deck. The ship was designed for 1,000 passengers, so they're already 670 people over what it was originally designed for. And because it was purely a cargo ship and they didn't need that much berth room for individual sailors on board. There was little or no provision for food. You were told to bring your own, which is why I find it amusing that the people who are boarding the ship are not carrying things. And water was available on a limited basis. You were given a quota for how much water you could take with you on this. Now, mind you, these are people who've paid for their passage to leave Russia. They're coming out of Libau, which is uh, in Latvia, and they're not having. It's not a real hospitable environment here. So, how did I get involved with Saratov? So this is the My Three Sons sort of photograph. It all started with this picture. This was in a collection that my family had had. My grandfather, in fact, is the boy in the middle. His younger brother's to his right, and the one standing up behind them, it says on the bottom of the photo, Jacob Hoffman, cousin. So Jacob was born in 1889 in Gomel, Belarus. Irving was born in New York in 1894, and Harry was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1897. The picture had to have been taken between 1907 and 1909, and you'll figure out why I know that it has to be taken in that range. So my grandfather, Irving Irving Hoffman, is in the middle, um, and the man on the left, Jacob, is a cousin. He looks like he's about 17 or 18 years old. He's my first cousin, twice removed. My great grandfather was a professional photographer, as was the rest of his family. We have thousands of photos of unknown relatives and pictures taken at my great grandfather's studios in Boston. There are pictures at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts that have the carte de visite, the sort of paper border that goes around the 3x5 or the 5x7 thick paper stock cards that say Hoffman Studios. But this is the only one we have of Jacob in Boston. Jacob's father, Aaron, my great granduncle, owned the second largest photography studio in Gomel, Belarus, from about the early 1900s to through the 1920s. And the family had been involved in photography as early as the 1860s, according to the family metrical lists and city directories that I've uncovered. That's pretty amazing, and we still have photographers in our family today. So this is the only other picture I have of Jacob. So the mystery is started. I have a picture of him when he's about 17 years old in Boston. Um, we don't know anything. I mean, I'm figuring it's somewhere between 1907, things like that. He's not on the 1910 census. Um, and this one's a picture of him in Russia, right? He's wearing a Russian uniform. This picture was taken the 22nd of April, 1912. And there's a flippant remark written in Russian on the back that said, "Does this uniform make me look fat?" I'm like, oh, for God's sakes. It sounds like, an 18 or a 19-year-old would say. He was in the 168th Mirgorod Infantry Regiment. It's a 42nd Infantry Division from Kiev. There's no other references to him on U.S. soil. He was not a recipient of any awards in the Russian military that I could locate. And I went to Moscow with the military records. And so we know he returned to Russia by 1912. Um, the home guard that he was in, or the military reserves group that he was in, um, was sort of a non-combat unit, right? This was prior to the Russian Revolution and World War One, and I don't know where he went from this unit since, I just know that he was physically in the group. I don't know what happened after he left it or anything like that. But I did find something. I was stunned to find an actual declaration of intent to naturalize for Jacob. Then there's no question that this is my cousin. So it says Jacob Hoffman. He's a photographer. He's from Gomel, Belarus, and you see it says Homel, Russia, which is interesting since there's no H in the Cyrillic alphabet. You would think it would have been Gomel, but it's not. It says he's lives at 125 Leverett Street in Boston, which is the site of my great grandfather's studio, which has since been razed. It was in the West End of Boston. They took the whole West End out to put in Mass General Hospital. He emigrated from Lvov, Russia, on the Saratov, and his foreign residence was in Gomel, Belarus. And he did this on the 7th day of July, 1907, which isn't exactly right. It was the 14th day of July, 1907. But he signed his name, so he obviously can write. This declaration was um, I would say petitioned, but it was actually filled out on the 8th day of June in 1909. So that gives us the range of when that stair step My Three Sons photo was taken. Sometime between 1907 and 1909, which is why he's not in the 1910 census. Okay, so therein lies the mystery I'm trying to solve. But the manifest held no one on board named Jacob Hoffman or even Yakov Goffman, which is what I expected. Manifest copies are in miserable shape. So you can see there are huge, huge chunks of it that are missing, and they happen to be right across the lines that I need. And there's other pieces on the bottom. You know, and what's interesting about all these manifests is most of the time they're missing not because something was done when they were being used when the people first arrived, so in 1907, but it was in subsequent moving around of the manifest books, or they were used. There's not a lot of notations in this particular forms, but many times you see all kinds of numbers and codes all over the document that tells you a little bit about the how the information that's on the manifest was used, but not in this particular case. Um, but I mean, the manifest copies are not in good condition. They all had missing pieces of pages. I went through three different copies of the manifest. I looked at the ancestry copies, the family search copies, and the find my past copies, and two other manifests of ships which were within a couple months looking for any name that I could come close to Jacob Hoffman. It wasn't until my heritage indexed column 17. And column 17 is the column. Let's see if I can do it here. Nope, doesn't want to. This is column 17 right here. So we have to actually look at what's written there. And I found my great grandfather's name. It's the name of the relative or friend at the destination. So we know that it starts and says, who did you leave behind? But more importantly, who are you going to? This is the who are you going to. The person listed as the traveler is a Sholem Babin. What? He's the right age, and he lists himself as a photographer. He's listed my great grandfather as a cousin, which is incorrect because he obviously was his uncle. The four boys, all with that Babin last name, range in age from 16 to 21. They're going to four different places. They have four different professions. So let's try to look at this a little bit more closely. So this is the same um, manifest, and what we've done is I've blown up columns 10 through 17, basically, and you can barely read the last residence and destination. So you sort of get trapped here reading. This says Minsk for the four boys, and then this is the column that has where they're going, and you can sort of see this is Jersey City, New Jersey. This is Boston, Massachusetts. This is London, Ontario. And we go over, and it says who they're going to. So it lists cousin, 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 and you've got all these different ones. There's the Jersey City one, but it says Mr. and it says J. L. Hoffman, and that says Leverett, 125 Boston, Massachusetts. And of course, 125 Leverett Street is the address of my great grandfather's photography studio. So right there, it set off a red flag to me that something's wrong. In the far right, you can make out my great grandfather's name and address, but in the far left hand column, you got four Babin boys. Who the heck are the Babins? So, as one might expect, three of the four boys wound up on the detention list, right? The oldest one, who was 21, didn't, which thankfully in this case it was not discarded, as so many were. But the detention list at least now identifies my great grandfather as Jacob's uncle. It may have been a mistake by the purser when he created the manifest in Laval. I still don't, I'm scratching my head over why. But if it was a planned trip, why didn't Jacob land? Why did he land in New York? The whole family was in Boston. He could have gone to Boston instead. Now, Boston's a lesser port. There maybe wasn't the opportunity. There certainly wasn't the opportunity to go out of Lipaia or Lebow in Latvia because that was the Russian fleet, and they went from that port to Rotterdam, strictly to New York. So, and moving east to go west made sense if you didn't want to get trapped by all those um, lines and checkpoints and things like that that I mentioned that were all over the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth and Germany. So um, I'm presuming someone had to take the train from Boston up to New York to pick up this kid. I've never found that out, but maybe someday I will. But it's if you look in that blue box that's down here, we got Schleicher Babin on line, I think it's 132 here. He's 18 years old, or he's on page 18 in line 17. And for want of a railway ticket, going to L. Hoffman, 125 Leverett Street in Boston, he had to make a phone call. And that's why I think somebody actually came up to pick him up. So maybe I could find this if I could, or figure this out if I could only find a certificate of arrival. USCIS couldn't help me. There's no file associated to Jacob Hoffman, nor was there any naturalization attempt by a Sholem or Schleicher Babin. The Schleicher, I presume, is a diminutive, maybe Yiddish name that he used, but USCIS couldn't find any certificate of arrival. But then again, he never filed a petition, so a certificate of arrival was not needed. But I found it searching for Sholem Babbitt, but it's associated to a gentleman by the name of Samuel Horowitz, who came over on the Saratov. Note the corresponding file numbers. That 57625 that is on the certificate right here is also correspondingly on the declaration of intent up here. Samuel Horowitz says he's from Minsk. And he came out of Labao on the Saratov on uh, the 14th day of July, 1906. We're off by a year. The certificate of arrival does say July 14th, 1907. But that, that's sort of fluid. That one wouldn't alarm me. But this guy, Samuel Horowitz, fully naturalized using this certificate of arrival. Is he anywhere on the Saratov manifest? Nope. And the best of all, the two documents are a year apart. He says he came over in '06, certificate of arrivals for '07. The petition date is fixed to '07. So we already got another mystery going on. We've got two people, one person who definitely came over using that name, another person who's uh, borrowing that name, so to speak. And how about researching the Babbins? Let's see what else we can find. Can't trace them, as that's not their real names, I'm presuming. I don't know who their friends or relatives were waiting for, right? So I don't know their original names. But it gets more interesting than that. This is a different manifest. This is for a completely different ship for the Moskva or the Moscow on July 8th, the next day. The Babbins are again listed on that manifest. They're crossed off and other names are written in their place. But this time, all going to the same individual in New York City. They do have the same starting relative on the second page. So they're coming from the same location. They're going to the same location, but that's a rabbit hole for a future dive. But let's see what else there is. I found two other manifests. Same four boys listed. 1907 or 1908 and 1941. So this is something that it's not endemic, but it's curious that the Russian line would have been um, pinpointed as a place for people to emigrate not lawfully. And we have a series of four boys who are now used on at least four different manifests that we've seen as being placeholders for other people. And we don't know who the people are who are associated with those. So it could be just a random occurrence or maybe not. So before I found all the extraneous records with the Babbins, I decided to try Google. I wanted to research the ship and the shipping line. Other than retrieving all these wonderful images of the ship itself, I also found some disturbing reports from the exact ship on which my cousin traveled. I'm going to read an article. I hate reading to you like this, but it makes more sense than having people read it themselves. This is the New York Times, dated Wednesday, July 17th, 1907. And remember, the Saratov docked at Ellis Island, or they were ferried to Ellis Island after it docked on July 14th, 3 days later. Girl stowaway found. It says, pretty Russian girl stowaway held at Ellis Island. A pretty 18-year-old Russian girl is a prisoner on Ellis Island today, charged with having come to this country a stowaway on the Russian Volunteer Company steamer Saratov. When detected, she was dressed as a man and was endeavoring to make her escape from the vessel, which is tied up at the Bush docks in Brooklyn. The girl was caught through the vigilance of the immigration officials who are carefully watching the steamers of the volunteer fleet. Again, remember I said that they already thought that there was something fishy going on. And the East Asiatic Company's steamers since the discovery of plans to smuggle in here many persons who are barred from this country because of physical reasons. The girl who first answered to the name of Alex, but who on the discovery of her sex gave her name as Paulina Flax of Kovno, Russia, tells an interesting story of her attempt to enter this country. She declared that no one helped her embark on the vessel and her presence had not been discovered. This is doubted by Commissioner Wackdorn and the case has already been put into the hands of the United States District Attorney to take action against the captain of the vessel should the evidence warrant it. On Sunday morning before dawn, the federal officers on watch at the vessel discovered a stowaway, Jan Gedman, a Russian. I presume it's Jan Gedman, a Russian, sliding down a hawser from the vessel to the pier. When discovered, the lad endeavored to get back on the vessel but was unable to do so. He, too, when questioned, declared that the officers and men on board did not know that he had made the trip with them and had not aided him to evade the immigration law. This, however, the inspector said was untrue, for they watched long enough to convince them that there were persons on deck helping the boy to get away. The lad denied also that he knew the young woman, though they both declare they are natives of the same town. Early Monday morning, the watchman on the pier noticed two persons leave the ship. Both were apparently members of the crew. He halted them and asked to see their shore leave passes. The biggest of the two promptly produced the necessary permit, and they were about to pass out the gate when the watchman noticed that the small man walked with rather an effeminate step, and then remembered that the young man had smooth and ruddy cheeks. His suspicions aroused, he ordered the young fellow back on the vessel. The stowaway later burst into tears and confessed that she was not Alex the man, but Paulina. In the detention pen on Ellis Island, she told the story of her attempt to enter the land from which she is barred, because, like the boy who was caught, she is suffering. The marine hospital doctors say with trachoma, a contagious disease of the eyes. I lived with my father and mother in Kovna, she said through an interpreter. My father, who was a mechanic, died some years ago, and recently my mother died, and I was left alone in the world. My father was not well to do, and so after the death of my mother, I had a hard time to get along. As I had no one when she died to go to, I made up my mind to come to America, where many of my townsmen had gone. I had just money enough to pay my way to Rotterdam, and there I got employment as a servant in a Dutch family. After 6 weeks, when the family went away for the summer, I told my employer of my desire to come to America, and he advised me to come as a stowaway, declaring that many came that way. I knew that the steamers from Lebault stopped in Rotterdam, and so I waited until the Saratov arrived here. In the bustle of departure, I got on board. I hid until the vessel got under way, and then mingled with the steerage passengers. I was not suspected and continued to live as a passenger on the voyage. On the way across, I met a countryman who I had known, and when we got here, he gave me a man's clothing and explained that the only way to get ashore was as a man, and after the officials had left the vessel. All day Sunday, I hid in cabin 3, and late that night, I tried to get ashore and was stopped. I saw some others, but they escaped being noticed. I do not want to go back to Russia, for I have no friends there. If I were allowed to land, I'm sure I could get along. It was an awful trip, for I lived continuously under a strain and feared every moment that I would be discovered by those on board. The immigration officials believe that there is a wholesale plot to get undesirables into this country. They say a man in Russia was established or has established a bureau for this purpose, and that he is working in league with a number of officers and seamen on the Russian vessels. They suspected that there were many more stowaways on board, as passports and papers seemed to be suspect. One man with trachoma was discovered in this city 3 weeks ago after he had went ashore from the steamer Estonia. The skipper and one of the officers have been indicted for that offense and are all now out on bail. Another chance discovery since has convinced the officers that there is such a plot. An inspector and an interpreter went up to the Grand Central Station some days ago on business. There they noticed three Russo-German immigrants. That's the other thing I meant to mention is that the Saratov was a lot of the Germans, the Russian Germans, were using it, right? The Volga Germans would use that port to leave Russia and come to the United States as well. They got into conversation with the men, and the latter freely told how they had landed from the steamer Estonia without going to the immigration station on Ellis Island. They declared that they had paid a man in Libau $25 each to get them on a steamer. They had also paid $35 to a member of the crew for passage and had followed it up with a fee of $12.50 each for the shore leave passes by which they had gained their freedom on this side. All three had trachoma. The federal officials say that they have reason to believe that about 40 diseased persons were smuggled in from that vessel alone who had not even been entered on the ship's manifest or put down as stowaways. There is, under Section 8 of the law from February 1907, a penalty of not less than $100 nor more than $1,000 or imprisonment not exceeding a year, or both, for shipmasters for every alien illegally landed. In the case of the girl, she declares that there was no watch on the gangway, and this, the officials say, denotes that precautions were not used to prevent illegal landing. And again, that source is from the New York Times, July 17th, 1907. So, the obvious question to this is how common is this? So, this incident was covered by no less than 20 newspapers. A very large spread on the front page of the Greencastle Herald had more details than the New York Times. Where? Greencastle? Indiana. Here's their addition to the story. According to the Russians, a Russian American at Libau is at the head of the business, and his operations are winked at by the Russian government officials, as he is instrumental in ridding that country of undesirable characters. From each immigrant to be smuggled, $75.50 is demanded in advance. I didn't add up the other pieces, but I don't think it adds up to $75. In return, the immigrant is furnished with a passport from his home to Libau, or if that's not convenient, to some other port, and is put aboard a vessel to America. Of the money paid, $35 goes to the man in Libau, that we heard, $25 to the member of the crew of the vessel upon which passage is taken, and $12.50 to an officer of the ship whose part in the plan is to afford the immigrant quote unquote shore leave when a U.S. port is reached. The Ellis Island authorities thought enough of the tale to detain the relators, people telling the story, and put on Toot a quiet investigation. Not quite sure what on Toot is. I guess it must be a 1910s sort of to put on the horn. When the Saratov of the Russian volunteer fleet arrived from Libau and Rotterdam, and the usual search of the vessel had been concluded, two inspectors remained on board. The clever ploy resulted in 5 arrests and deportations. My guess is they missed a few. So um, they were caught, deported, and then they tried again. Most of them were men leaving to avoid conscription into the army. A sophisticated smuggling ring was uncovered in Libau that had tacit Russian approval. So, what happened to Jacob? So, Jacob goes back to Russia. We have no return documents. There's a whole book on the number of people who did return. That's in the syllabus that accompanies the talk. But there, I have no information on Jacob in particular until this one notation that he was part of an evacuation from Gomel, Belarus, to a gulag in the Saratov Oblast, of all places, in 1942. And he's listed here with his wife Nadezhda and his daughter Polina. The birth year matches, the occupation is a photographer, and his daughter's name is also Jacob's mother's name. So that's enough of a coincidence to allow me to write a proof statement saying that, yep, this is him. And just to round out what I learned about Jacob for the remaining years is um, he did eventually make it back to Gomel because here's his headstone. In Gomel, Belarus, the patronymic is consistent with his father's name, which is Aaron. And it says he was born in 1889 and died in 1951. I'm still researching to see if I can find his daughter, Polina Goffman, who would most likely have passed by now, but may have other relatives still in Belarus. And our challenge is, of course, getting records out of Belarus at this point in time because they're non existent. Ukraine would have been easier, but not Belarus. Or maybe she's somewhere else in Eastern Europe. I don't know. But that is shedding light on this misadventure. So the Saratov really was only in operation for 2 years, and it only ran to the United States and back 5 times. But boy, did it cause a lot of international incidents. And with that, I thank you for attending. Olivia, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much. It looks like we have one quick question in the Q&A, but if anyone else has any other questions or needs the handout link, I did put it in the chat, but yeah, if anyone missed that. But yeah, the question we have from Peter is, what is predatory practices?
Well, the predatory practices in terms of trying to reduce what someone was carrying for goods on board, so they're stripping people of their um, the their money, their goods, and then when they get on the ship, they were charging for food, they were charging for excess water. They there was a whole racket. If you think about coming off of a ship, you're coming into a land that you don't know the language, you don't know the customs. Um, Generally, these are not people who are well-to-do or even middle class. They probably haven't even been out of their local town. And they're going to be pried upon by just about everybody who's out there and says, I can get you a room to stay in, or, if you give me this much money, I'll show you around, or I'll find you a job and things like that. So there were an awful lot of opportunities for people to be taken advantage of, whether it was in the process of getting to the ship in the initial stages when they were on board the ship or even once they landed. And there's all kinds of books written and diaries that were kept by people who, had all kinds of horrific experiences if they didn't have an exact person to go to, and that somebody was meeting them in coming off the ship, or they knew exactly how to go through from their home to whatever carriage ride they needed to get to the train, from the train to the ship, what extras you needed to pay for. They're just taking advantage of, and that all those are predatory practices that were done by individuals, by shipping lines, by um, you know, anybody, any kind of conveyance in between. So it wasn't fun. I mean, it was not easy, and I applaud everybody who even attempted to leave their home where, maybe they had nothing, but it was a nightmare to come to the United States. It was not easy.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on October 17th with Maureen Brady. She will be giving a presentation on mining the treasures of family search. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fh_webinars@byu.edu or follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.